Welcome back to the Lutheran World. It's been a minute. I got very busy with helping to start a immigrant mission organization here in Central Ohio, with life in general, with family. So it's been a little while. However, I am very blessed today to have with me Pastor Tapani Simojoki, and we are talking all things Bach, and I hope you'll enjoy. Welcome back to the Lutheran World, and I'm pleased to be joined by Pastor Tapani Simojoki, and we are talking today about one of his absolute favorite topics, Johann Sebastian Bach. So, uh, Pastor, tell us, how did you start to become interested in Bach?
It's really great to be back with you again. Thanks for the invitation. This is almost in my mother's milk. I grew up in a household where my father was a pastor, and he was very very rarely at home during the day. My mum was at home with us. I'm one of six children, so it's a busy household. And but she grew up in a very musical household. Her father was a very competent amateur percussionist. Her brother was very nearly became a concert pianist, and there was always music in the house. Um, Several of her uncles and so were musicians, and so we always had, well, this revealing my age here, but an LP on during the day, and two composers predominated when Mum was at home.
You could have pretended there that you were more just a hipster than you used the LPs for the
Spotify,
vinyl,
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, so it was Vivaldi, and especially Bach.
Yeah.
She just loved that music, as did my father. When Dad got home, we might get a bit more Beethoven on as well and stuff like that. But basically, there was a lot of music going on in my household. I started playing the piano myself from the age of 5. Started having lessons, and as in a lot of musical education systems, the one I learned with, the mainstay of all learning is Bach. You play Bach and something. So all the exams I had to take, any auditions for music school, whatever, everything, you had to play one Bach and then a couple of other pieces. That was just
Yeah, I can remember that. I played cello growing up, and a lot of the pieces that you learn early on are simplified versions of Bach.
yeah.
And
So it's
yeah.
kind of it's become such a mainstay of Western musical canon that
Mhm.
I just grew up with it, and from a young age was playing a lot of his music. I joined a boys choir when I was 8 years old, local in a local nearby town, and I joined at a really good time. They started a run that went on for about 15 years, where they would perform the St. John Passion by Bach
Oh
every
man.
every
Wow.
Holy Week,
That's
two
awesome.
concerts. And the first year they did it was from the age of 8. By the time I was about 12, I could sing the whole thing
Yeah.
in German, which I didn't speak. But I could sing the whole thing in German, uh, from memory. So
Wow.
this is just such a mainstay of my. So it's been with me all my life.
Yeah.
I've had musical experiences, some musical education as well, and that's just increased my appreciation of it, and I've come to understand the astounding quality of this music on kind of every level, artistically, technically, spiritually.
Hmm.
Just Bach is a complete giant. I mean, his name means Bach means brook, and
Hmm.
already Beethoven. When Ludwig van Beethoven, who was the kind of the big superstar of his day and one of the great composers of the Western musical history, in his day, Johann Sebastian wasn't the Bach. If people said Bach, they meant one of his sons,
Mm.
CPE, or then they say old Bach if they meant Johann Sebastian. And Beethoven made a famous pun where he said that his name shouldn't be Bach, brook, but ocean.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. So you grew up, that's awesome that you grew up singing the St. John Passion. That I did not grow up surrounded by that kind of thing, but I have always wanted to be able to go and see a performance of either
Mm.
the St. Matthew or St. John Passion. I
Mm.
think that would be fantastic.
It's
Um,
just it's a life transforming experience, really is.
yeah, yeah.
Without exaggerating at all, completely. For a young child to have that is such a privilege.
So Bach is a obviously genius musician, but I think one of the things people maybe don't always realize is how much of a theologian he was. Share with us a little bit about the faith that he has.
Okay, so I think to answer that question, we need to kind of roll back a bit and so zoom out into the wider background.
Right?
Music in the Lutheran Church has always had an incredibly important place. I mean, Martin Luther himself was a very competent a musician. He had a fine tenor voice. He played the lute very competently. He even composed. I mean, he's some of the hymns that he wrote. He composed the tune himself. There's even a little motet that he, not motet, but just a little choral piece that he wrote, which is not very ambitious, but it's very competent. And he had a very high regard for music. So his famous saying is that, as far as he's concerned, music is next to theology,
Right.
as the gifts of God. The word of God is the greatest gift God has given us, followed then by music. And so the Lutheran Church, from the very beginning of the Reformation, put a lot of emphasis on music, not only the writing of hymns, but also of wider church music. A lot of people don't probably realize this, but for example, many of the bigger churches kept either occasional services in Latin or services on high feasts where part of the service was still in Latin, so that they could make use of the huge riches of Latin settings of the divine service.
Mm.
And so when you get to the 17th and 18th centuries, you look at church music in Europe. Basically, there are a couple of centers of church music which produce disproportionate numbers of very high, fine quality, fine composers. Italy, and to a lesser degree, Spain and France produced these great composers of Catholic church music, and Germany produced a great number of very fine composers. Already in the early 1600s, you got Pretorius. A bit later on in the 1600s, you got Heinrich Schütz, who was one of the greatest composers of the whole of the 18th century. And then in the early 18th century, first half of the 18th century, you kind of got this peak of this movement with Bach and Handel. Mm-hmm. So the two great geniuses who are actually born in the same year as each other.
Is that right?
Yeah. So wow. That's the setting, and so music was central to the church and church's life, and therefore also theology was central to the musical life. Mm-hmm. And you could, there was no kind of distinction between secular composers and religious composers. Most musicians made their living playing for civic and church occasions. And so this is the world into which Bach was born. Not only that, but he was born into this family that was so prolific in the church music scene that the word Bach simply came to mean a church musician. So people, a bit like vacuum cleaners in this country called Hoovers. You talk about Cromptons, and the brand becomes the kind of the name for the whole thing. And so people would say, when a musical director retires or dies, that we need a new Bach. And it didn't mean, that he had to be that name. He just church musician. And so his father was a very capable musician who played for both church and the city in Erfurt. His uncle, his cousins, he was one of 5 surviving children, and all his brothers, as well as himself, became church musicians. Several of his cousins, uncles, his maternal cousin was a guy called Johann Walter, who was one of the great organists of his day. Same age, it was just so the family was completely steeped in this church musical culture. Bach himself, he was orphaned at a young age. He was only 9 years old when his parents, he'd lost both his parents, went to live with his brother, and just because of the circumstances, the chips fell nicely for him, and he got a very good education. His first school was the Latin school in Eisenach, where he was a chorister in the same choir that a certain Martin Luther had been a chorister 200 years earlier, went to the same school, sang in the same choir. But he went to he got a very fine education from his sort of, when he was in his early teens and mid-teens, which included not only music, but humanities and Orthodox Lutheran theology, which is at the core of the curriculum. And this is at a time when pietism is beginning really to gain a significant foothold in the church. So this is the kind of turning point around early 1700s, where or late 1600s, early 1700s, where Pietism and Orthodox Lutheranism are essentially kind of in this battle over dominance within the church. And Bach, throughout his career, repeatedly found himself on that fault line. And you can see that in his kind of, he was influenced by both.
Yeah.
When he came to the, if you like, when he came to the tug of war, he always took his side very much on the Orthodox side. So he was educated in Orthodox Lutheranism. He owned in his library. We know what his library consisted of when he died, and he owned several volumes of dogmatic theological works, which underlined and notated his Bible. His personal Bible, has a lot of annotations. You can buy a facsimile of it today. And you can see that this wasn't just a job for him. He happened to work in the church, but it's something that he very much lived and breathed in his sort of personal life. I mean, he was a difficult character in many ways. He got into scrapes, and it was a time when he asked for 4 weeks leave to go and visit Dietrich Buxtehude, who was the greatest organist in northern Germany. He went on foot and he came back 4 months later. And when his employers asked him what has it been, he wrote back quite rudely. He sat in prison once for getting into a fight. He wasn't an easy character.
Yeah. I think I think when you deal with genius, a lot of times that is what you deal with.
But at the same time, he was. But you could see that his personal piety. Was
and
very much.
I would say kind of being on that fault line of the Orthodox pietism is not a bad place to be, because the pietists had some legitimate complaints, some legitimate points that they were making about what was happening in the world at that point. But you also don't want to go fully pietistic to where you are abandoning the solid foundation of theology that you have.
No, so what you get is this kind of sweet spot where there's a lot of the kind of pietist kind of sort of emphasis on personal reflection on and personal response to the gospel, but the gospel remains the gospel as the personal experience never takes over as the center of the theology. And you see this in a lot of Bach's works. I mean, he didn't write the text for most of his works. Mm-hmm. He used texts of others. Sometimes he collaborated with poets. Sometimes he just took existing texts. But you can see that there is a kind of that's the in the air or in the water at the time. But it's very much is a cross-focused kind of Christologically solid and sound theological foundation. Particularly so, I think there's a kind of it's unstated but very firm kind of baptismal theology kind of foundation to a lot of this.
Yeah, and you can tell there's a richness of the theology in the works that he has. It's not you can't just kind of halfway and get the richness of theology that he has in his works. So clearly he studied a great deal.
Yeah. And you can see, I mean, there are all sorts of things that came really beautiful together at the, what's called the kind of high Baroque or late Baroque period of music, which really ended with Bach and Handel's death. They were the kind of the last Baroque composers. And then, before then you got the whole, Bach's sons were already moving in a completely different musical world. But some of the things that came together, first, so there's a great deal of rigor. So, Bach's absolute love musically was the fugue and the canon, and which is a very rigid art form, because it has to be. So, for those of you who aren't particularly familiar with it, but the fugue, the word comes from the Greek word for running away or escaping. And what you have is you've got two or more independent parts, which are in imitation of each other, but play, at a remove. So one is always chasing the other. And it requires a great deal of skill, because you have to, you start with a theme, and then you move on to the second theme while another voice starts playing the first theme, and they have to match perfectly.
Wow.
And contrast. And there are all kinds of tricks that you can do. You can, sometimes you play back to front or upside down and all those sorts of things. And there are various rules about how the harmonic progression goes. And then you kind of bring it all together at the end. And this was every composer of that time was writing them. Mm-hmm. But it turned out that Bach was just way and beyond greater fugue writer than anybody before or after. And he loved it. And the fugue is to the composer a little bit like a sonnet is to a poet. where
Yeah.
you've got this sort of straight jacket, and you have to create your art within that. And
Yeah, there's that
and
there's a
that
beauty of that, because it's reflective of creation in
it
that.
is. And what it does is it focuses, it forces you
Yeah.
to kind of condense and crystallize your gift in a way that it's like the the kind of the these like a pearl that's formed inside a shell, or the kind of thing that
Yeah.
it's a bit like when the American poet Robert Frost was asked about what he thought about free verse poetry, and he said it's a bit like playing tennis with a net down. There's that the challenges actually bring out the genius,
Yeah.
as and the restrictions, and Bach wrote within this, and that of course fits in beautifully with the whole idea of a theology where the
Yeah.
freedom this is created within these safe boundaries that God has created, and
Yeah. Yeah,
God's law
exactly.
sets a
Exactly.
safe house in which we can be kind of in if like a protected freedom, protected
That's
free.
exactly what I was thinking about
Mm.
with that was, God's given us the commandments, and
Yeah,
he's given us, the natural order, the
yeah,
way in which he has ordered the world to work. And when we operate within that, it's actually far better and far more beautiful, and we flourish within that. And when there are no rules, and there's no boundaries, and there's no expectations, it becomes far less than what God has
absolutely.
made it to be.
Yeah. The other thing that was going on at the same time is that the quality of education was actually very high. And part of it was that part of the result was that everybody could write poetry.
Mm.
And then some people were really good at it and they became poets. Yeah, everybody could, and then some were artists. And so there's a lot of poetry around. Some of the great hymn writers of the 1600s, like Paul Gerhardt,
You're right.
they were just, Paul Gerhardt he was a pastor, but he wrote poetry such that people, if you study in German, you still read his hymns text as poetry in
Yeah.
your German classes. And then there are all sorts of other things going on, like a real interest in numerology
Mm.
and symbolic numbers. So Bach hides in his music all kinds of very, very clever numerological tricks and things. When you convert letters of the alphabet to numerical values, and then you create these beautiful mathematical patterns, which you can't really hear. You can only see them on the score. But again, there are all these things that you kind of added extra hurdles
Yeah.
to the compositional process, which kind of forced his gift to come to the fore in such a way that when all this comes together, you end up with this, and with his personal, the God-given talent that he had, out comes this sublime music. And he was
Mm.
just incapable of, even when there's sometimes he was in a real rush.
Yeah.
Like my great interest in the last few years has been his church cantatas. I mean,
Right.
he wrote, there are 200 that survive. His son says that he wrote another 100 which have been lost. And there was one year when he, for 3 years, sorry, when he first took his final post, last quarter of a century of his life, 27 years he lived in Leipzig as the director of music for the churches of Leipzig. And for the first 3 years there, he produced a new cantata every Sunday,
Oh my
plus
gosh.
extra ones for Epiphany, Ascension, etc. He was producing 60 cantatas a year. So what would happen is that he start writing one on Monday. By Friday, he had been hand copied and he was being rehearsed. He was sung in the service on Sunday, and then Monday he starts the next one for 3 years.
I mean, to do that 1 week
Yeah,
would be an incredible accomplishment.
yeah,
But
yeah. Because
week
I
after
did a
week
series
after week.
I did a series of radio programs for a year for Lutheran Radio UK on the
Right.
cantatas, and I was thinking, it took me quite a lot of the week to produce each program on one cantata. In the same
Yeah.
time, Bach composed the thing from scratch, had it copied by hand, rehearsed, and performed. But the thing is that he was in such a hurry that some of the less important Sundays he was composing by numbers.
Mm.
He was just producing, he was just churning this stuff out. But
Yeah.
even when he did that, he was like, you still put it above the,
Right.
he put it in the top 10% of music ever written,
Mm.
just because his base level was so high. And when he was asked, what makes you so good? And he says, I just work harder than everybody else.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, he probably did work harder than everybody else, but he had a genius combined with
Yeah.
that hard work.
Yeah.
And that's where
And
you
there's a great
see the
humility. I
excellence.
mean, he was, in some ways,
Yeah.
he was very, very aware of his worth and value. And
Sure.
he was forever trying to get a better job and better paid job, and trying to negotiate a better wage for himself. And he had 20 children, of whom only 9 survived. He buried one wife and 11 children in his lifetime.
Wow.
There's a lot of suffering, and
Yeah.
that also comes through in his work. A real kind of having become orphaned by the age of 9 and having lost 4 siblings. His 4 siblings had died by the time he was the youngest, but and there's death everywhere. The infant
Right.
death rate in Germany at that time was absolutely brutal. So he had a lot of encounter with death and the kind of reality of the fact that you never know.
Yeah.
His first wife died. He went on a trip with his employer for a month. When he came back, his wife was dead and buried. He walked, and the first he knew of it was when he walked into the house.
Man.
Where's mum? Oh, she's dead and buried. This is the world in which he lived. But
Right.
but he was also very aware of his his mortality, and so every a lot of his manuscripts of music that survive is in his own hand have the letters JJ inscribed at the top of the first page. Jesu Juva, Jesus help.
Right.
And then at the bottom he wrote SDG, Soli Deo Gloria, not just for his sacred music, but also for his secular music, so-called or kind of non-religious, just instrumental music.
Right. Right. Because it's all sacred in that sense.
It is. And there's an amazing, we've talked about the kind of idea of order and orderness. It's something that we as Westerners, I think, probably take for granted because we've been so thoroughly washed culturally in the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a fascinating article by Uwe Simojoki, which he wrote for the Concordia Institute several years ago now, about the influence of Bach in Japan. One of the finest performers of Bach's music currently is a band called an orchestra and choir called Bach Collegium Japan. Its founder is a Japanese Christian, Reformed Christian called Masaaki Suzuki, and but he has recorded a huge amount of Bach's music, both choral music, but also he's a very fine organist and harpsichord player, and his son is likewise, and his brother. They're all kind of the whole family are involved in it.
It's a new family of Bachs, right?
Yeah, you need a Suzuki. But he tells when most of the musicians that he worked with are Japanese, and most of them are completely ignorant of Christianity. The Christian church never taken a foothold in Japan. And so he says that every time they recorded every single church cantata of Bach. It took 20 years.
Wow.
I said before every recording session, before the first rehearsal, he'd have to do the Bible study with the musicians. He said you can't play and sing this music unless you understand the theology. Wow. So he'd have to explain all these concepts of redemption and sin and things. Japanese apparently doesn't have a word for sin. They just don't have that concept. They're shame, but not sin.
Yeah, which is not the same. Not even close, really.
No, I mean, but the amazing thing is that it's not just the sacred music. There is in fact, and this is the article from Uwe Simojoki, is that it includes an interview with a Catholic priest in America who's Japanese born. And the way he became a Christian was by listening to Bach's keyboard music, his fugue, preludes and fugues.
So not even the theological.
No words. But he said that it opened up to him a world which his Japanese culture and religious background could not explain.
Oh wow!
And that led him on a search that eventually led to his baptism and ordination into the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church.
It's very Romans, that God is seeking even through the creation to call out.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think again, it's this is in the Bach's music it's not just Christianity dressed in Western music,
right?
But it's rather faith, the faith kind of being sung and played, and the music comes through. The theology comes through the music. One of the things that was absolutely kind of essential to church music in the culture of this 17th century and 18th century was the idea that the task of the composer of the music is to bring what they called affects. So, in other words, to dress, to give expression to the sentiment, and to produce a response in the hearer. I sometimes use
no, hold on. Lutherans don't do that, right? We don't. We're stoic and we can't have any emotion about things. But
but the idea is again, it's not just that you feel emotional, but rather that your whole kind of spiritual and emotional response is appropriate to the music, so that
But
so
it's
that's
let me stop you for just a second, because I think we've gotten this the other way around in our current way of thinking about, music. Is we start with the music, and then we say, what can we stuff into that with Christian words,
yes,
that kind of fit what we like as far as the music, instead of starting with that underlying, theological sentiment that needs now to find its expression through music.
yeah.
And so we get the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it's a really simple illustration. This is something, from Martin Luther's own musical writing, and he picked up this trick from his, I think, probably got it from his favorite composer, who was not a Lutheran, but the setting Psalm 130, from depths of woe, and the tune starts with from depths of woe, and it's that drop of a fifth.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of if you think about it, if you're written from depths of, it's
Yeah.
like no, there's further to go.
It sounds more natural to our ear to do
Yeah,
the second way, but that
yeah,
first one, because it's such a stark change from what you might expect, it
yeah, and
expresses that in
it
a way
does.
that you actually feel the depth.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but basically, if you use any other interval,
Uh-huh.
it either sounds like there's further to go, or you're already bouncing back. But you land on that
Yeah.
note,
Uh-huh.
and you can't, musically speaking, there's nowhere deeper to go.
Yeah.
It's like you hit the bottom, and that's a good example. Now, it's something that is almost kind of to good composer. That's so natural. I'm sure Bach wouldn't say how do I express this. How do it would come out. But there are all so many, so many kind of ways in which the composer works to bring in subtle and obvious ways, and kind of both covert and overt ways to give expression to that, to the sentiment that's being said, whether it's a theological sentiment or some other. So for example, the St. John Passion. St. John Passion uses, as the name suggests, the text of Christ's Passion according to St. John, Gospel of John, except there's one insertion. There's one bit where he adds something, and he takes from Matthew's Gospel when Peter has denied Christ the third time and the cock crows. Bach borrows from Matthew's Gospel that Peter went and wept bitterly. Now, go and listen to, go to YouTube, sort of wherever you get your music or your CD collection, and listen to that bit. But he doesn't just, the rest of the text around it is so-called recitative. It's just kind of recited, fairly simple recitation of the notes. And all of a sudden, at that point, he creates this incredibly long, chromatic kind of wailing sort of a progression of notes. We doesn't just say that Peter wept, but he wept. Yeah, and he creates the music that says, and all of a sudden, if you've been dozing off, just this is I know this, like, oh, what happened there?
Yeah.
It draws you into that moment. On the other hand, for example, I think most musicians would agree that if you had to have just, if you wanted to dance, you can only have one composer's music ever, you'd always go for Bach. And, like the opening of the Christmas Oratorio, which is actually a series of 6 cantatas that are kind of put together to be performed through the Advent and Christmas period. And the opening of the whole thing is like this joyful chorus, Jauter frohlocke, rejoice and be glad, is the opening words. And it's about the kind of Christ coming down, and what you start this quiet drums playing, dum, bum, 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 and the woodwind go, and then all of a sudden you kind of this cascading like angels coming down, this sort of scales that tumble over each other, over and over again. I played it once very badly. I played the cello too when I was younger. Tried to play. I wasn't good enough for that, but they just tumble down over the instruments, falling over each other as this gift from heaven comes down, and then this dance starts, and dance from rejoice. And it's nothing, again, it's not kind of saying hold it in your face like Handel sometimes does. in Messiah, he says, the setting of the, thou shalt dash them in pieces, and in the music, thou shalt dash them in pieces. It's kind of
Right.
really obvious, like, look what I'm doing here, folks, but the music just it takes the words, takes it and said, all right, how can I best deliver this message to you in such a way that it doesn't just hit your head, but it penetrates into your heart and into your belly and into your whole being, so that
a full experience.
It makes you more joyful. It's a bit like Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I used to do this when I was teacher. I used to get the worst reader in the class to read it out from a page. And then they said, "Do you know that's the most famous speech in the kind of in 20th century?" And everybody saying, "Well, is it?" And then I play the way that Martin Luther King delivers, and you realize the delivery is as important as the actual words.
That's interesting. That's very much pertinent to sermons, isn't it? That it's not just the well, here's a really good sermon, let me read it at you. But the way in which it's delivered has an impact.
Yeah. And the thing is that I think we as modern post-enlightenment, post-rational Westerners put too much emphasis on purely the kind of intellectual process as Christians, as theologians, on the intellectual process of just is kind of propositional statements,
right?
Knowing that, whereas what you see when you look at something like read through the New Testament. It's pretty emotional stuff, Jesus weeps and, rejoice in the Lord always. And, look at someone like Paul, who had a pretty tough life.
Right.
Just count the number of times he uses the word rejoice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's always all over the place.
Yeah. And this kind of, and the whole, I think we need to kind of hear this, is the whole understanding that God has created us entire.
Yeah. We get pretty Gnostic, don't we? I mean, we get very just in our heads, and that's the only real part. And as if our bodies and our emotions and all of that is not real.
That's one part, and then the other thing that we are terribly pragmatic and utilitarian.
Yeah.
They're kind of, how does it contribute to the economy? What good does it do? So
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you don't
what's
say,
going to be cut first in a school is going to be the music program, because
and then you
what good does that really do?
Exactly. And we're going to take a whole extended family now and say, okay, for 5 generations, all these people are ever going to do is practice and play the instruments.
Yeah.
For not a lot of pay. So can't you do anything useful with that talent? Right. But this is if I tell you the name, family's called Bach, okay, fine, fair enough. People are going to make a lot of money recording his music later on.
So they're still utilitarian.
Yeah. Whereas son of Bach, he was all we can tell, he was in some ways he was a really ordinary man. He lived a mundane life. He wasn't your kind of genius of the kind of romantic imagination. He had a very busy household. He had his 20 children, and his wife. He taught at the school. He had choir rehearsals every day. He clearly, apparently, he liked his taverns. He liked to drink. He enjoyed beer, and he just had a really busy life. He worked really hard. He took a huge interest in not just the playing of organ. He was a fearsomely good organist, but he also took a huge interest in the construction of organs. So when people, church would build an organ, they would ask Bach to come and give them advice and test it out and tell them how it could be made better. All that kind of stuff. He worked incredibly hard at this so that you could say at the end SDG.
Yeah.
Sorry, glory, to God alone be glory.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a great lesson for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah. And so and you will find that for example, one of the finest conductors of Bach's music in the last quarter century or more, John Eliot Gardiner, English conductor. He himself is an agnostic, and he doesn't get the theology at all. He wrote a fantastic book on Bach's sacred music called Music in the Castle of Heaven, where he's completely dismissive of the fact that sermons were long and people went to church, and he just assumes that everybody found it really boring and terrible. In fact, we know from records, there's a very good book study on the subject, that people used to complain if the sermons were too short. They wanted to be taught properly, and people went to church several times. There was communion 3 times a week, and people went to confession, by their hundreds every week, and so on. It was a really kind of vibrant culture of that sort. But John Eliot Gardiner, even though is very dismissive of the theology, he gets it, he understands it. And
I read something. I can't remember where I came across this now. That sometimes during the sermon, some of the choir might leave for a time because it was quite cold, oftentimes, and they would go into a smaller room and be able to kind of get something to drink and be able to be prepared for continuing the service afterwards. But they didn't just miss out on the sermon. Bach would have sermons in the room that would then be read to them, and they would hear that and have that shared.
Yeah, I mean, the reading of postals, church collection sermons was very, very important. And the thing is, again, the choir, they would sing the cantata just before the sermon, and so often the cantata would be so long that you say half the cantata before and half after. It was a lot of hard work. I mean, and a lot of, and all the half the singers were young boys, boys whose voice hadn't broken it under the age of 14. They didn't need that break, but you look at this and you don't need to be a Christian to see that actually the faith shines through.
Yeah.
And when you then come to the sacred works, I mean the instrumental works and some of the secular cantatas, which are written for birthdays and so on, in themselves are impressive. And if you want a bit of comedy, there's a coffee cantata, things like that. Where it's just having a bit of a laugh. But you get to the sacred cantatas and the oratorios, the passions, and the B minor mass, which is kind of his kind of magnum opus in many ways. You see that there is this incredible seriousness where, like the B minor mass, it was never performed in his lifetime. He wasn't even liturgically performable. It's far too big. He wrote it just because, never expecting it ever to be performed.
Wow.
Because, and he recycled some of his old music, but he recycled in such a way that it became perfect for that occasion. And you see that there's this sort of incredible seriousness of wanting to put take his gift and all his training and skill. I said, how can I perfect my craft to give the best, well, as it is, a theoretical expression to the divine service? Our answer, B minor mass. Or, I'm going to, music for the Passion Week in Leipzig. I know the congregation is going to sit for 3.5 hours, listen to my St. Matthew Passion.
Wow.
Because can't do anything less than, this is what it requires. And it's this sort of, it's the seriousness of it. He didn't make any more or less money.
Right.
He was salaried, who's on a retainer. You make any more or less money if you worked hard or less hard.
Yeah.
But
he was doing it for the glory of God. Yeah,
there was this this compulsion to do it, and I'm sure there would have been I don't want to sanctify the man anymore, and he was I'm not sure we would have got on particularly in real life. He probably everybody found it very awkward, but I'm sure there was a part of him that said I want to also do my best, because he realized that he was very, very good.
Sure. Yeah, to whom much is given, much is required. Right? We when we have a gift from God, we are to use that, and we're to develop that and do well with that. You mentioned him recycling his works. I think there's a genius to the way in which he did that. Sometimes, though, you'll hear, "Wake Awake," just periodically put in, and you go, "Oh, I know that," and okay, what is this telling me? And so you'll hear things that are familiar, and he knows that they're familiar to you, and so he makes use of that.
Well, it's like in the Matthew Passion, the opening chorus has got this huge
that's one of my absolute favorite
pieces
ever.
I once got to sing in the boys' choir bit, because you've got double choir and a double orchestra, and they sing this sort of antiphonal kind of addressing the church as the bridegroom, is hastening, go and see your bride. So bride, go and see your bridegroom. Come daughters, and in the middle of all of a sudden, this really complex, multi-part, 8 voice vocal parts and the 2 orchestras playing this very complex music. And all of a sudden, through that comes a boys' choir singing "Lamb of God, pure and holy." On top of all of that, and it's like there's this sort of melee of people rushing to see Jesus, and then
because it sounds really busy.
And then
Really?
there's a bright light in the middle of it saying, Lamb of God, pure and holy, who on the
mm,
cross did suffer, ever
wow.
patient and lowly. And it's just, those sort of moments. And he
Yeah.
wasn't the only one who did that, but nobody did it like that.
Yeah.
And that's, we haven't even talked about his chorale preludes and chorale arrangements, or how he would take a hymn and arrange it or harmonize it 15 different ways depending on which verse you're singing.
Mm.
Um,
So let's talk about the cantatas, the Sunday
yeah,
cantatas a little bit.
yeah.
First of all, how did you get interested in that, and
Um,
get this program started of I'm going to have a radio program that covers every single one of these. What kind of
yeah.
madness was that? But
Uh,
then, what where did this come from for Bach?
it came for Bach. He came into a well-established tradition. So by the time he was born, it was just part of in bigger towns and cities where they could afford musicians. It was just part of the Lutheran tradition that on Sundays and feast days you would have a cantata as part of the divine service.
Mm,
Kind of a
wow.
typical Sunday service would last 3 hours. They said an hour before the sermon, an hour for the sermon, an hour after the sermon. But the hour of the sermon wouldn't just be the sermon; it would include the hymn. It would include the hymn of the day and the cantata. Which so the you have these cantatas. It was just expected of directors of music to either produce or to compose a
Hmm.
cantata each Sunday, and some would compose their own, some would use each other's, and most would do a mixture. And some like so the most prolific composer of them all, Telemann, who was a friend of Bach's and a near contemporary and a godfather to his son, he wrote over 1,000.
Oh, wow.
And this guy was just, if you talk about productive, I mean, he left Bach in the dust in terms of just
Wow.
producing endless music. But Bach only wrote 300. But he was just part of the tradition. And just before Bach became active in the church, I mean, he got his first job as an organist at age 18. And some of his finest cantatas were written when he was in his early 20s, like the Easter
Wow.
cantata on Christ Lane, Death Strong Bands. But he walked. There had been a change, a new format that had come about. A pastor and hymn writer called Hermann Neumeister, who also wrote a lot of script or texts for cantatas to be composed as cantatas. He took a latest fashion from opera, and which was to have instead of having through composed music, lots of everything was sung in a melodious way. You'd have arias, like songs, interspersed with recitatives, like recitation of the text, which is a new sort of fairly new idea in opera composing. And Neumeister said, why don't we take that operatic convention and bring it into the church so that you can get clearer expression of the text by having this recitation, which is not, it's just the voice and a very basic accompaniment, and the music is composed not to give a beautiful melody but simply to accentuate the text.
Yeah.
So if your voice goes up in a sentence, the music goes up and down again. And Bach's first couple of cantatas were written in this style, in the old German style, through composed style, and they're beautiful. And John Eliot Gardiner kind of regrets that he left that style behind. He says, wish he hadn't gone. But he then started writing these Neumeister cantatas, as they were known. And he became very, very good at them. His recitative writing, again, is second to none. He was just genius. He had, like Luther, he had a real sense for the language and the sound of the language and the ability to kind of bring it out. And so it was just a job requirement. Wherever he was, he worked in secular employment for several years in Kherson, where he wrote no church music at all because his employer was reformed and didn't want any church music. He wrote that's where he wrote a lot of his concertos and things like that. But wherever he worked in a church, which was most of his adult life, he was just required to produce cantatas, and he would sometimes recycle other people's cantatas, but a lot of the time he would write his own. That's just how it was done. There are 200 of them.
Wow.
And it takes a long time to get through them, as Bach took 20 years to record them all. The Monteverdi Choir in England, John Eliot Gardiner's band, they did this Bach pilgrimage in the year 2000, where they performed every Sunday through the year in different cities around the world, all the cantatas written for that Sunday by Bach, and then released that. It's a astounding sort of achievement. But this thing exists there, but they are written for a particular moment. They're
Hmm.
too short to put into a concert, like a Passion
Sure.
or something. But they're too long just to be fillers in a concert of other things. And they're kind of awkward because they're not designed to be performed in a concert. They're designed to be part of the divine service.
Yeah.
So they're not as well known, except some of the, they're famous bits that everybody knows, but
Yeah.
very, very, very few. And I too, I mean, I've grown up with Bach's music. I just didn't know the cantatas at all. So when my friend and colleague, our mutual friend Jamie Krieger, set up Lutheran Radio UK and said, then started writing to the pastor saying, guys, I've got the radio, but you need to give me the programs. What can you do? And I thought, this would be a real opportunity. So I proposed the idea to him, to Jamie, say, look, why don't I do like a little introduction to these cantatas for every Sunday. We do a whole year's worth. So I didn't do all the cantatas. I just did a year's worth. So covered about just about 60. So just under a third of them in 1 year, where, I would spend a day researching and then writing the script, half a day recording because I'm so bad at it.
Oh, it's and for anybody that hasn't done recording like that,
Yeah.
it's
So
way more time consuming than anyone realizes.
Oh, it is, yeah. So I would then record these things and introduce in a half-hour program, and depending how long the cantata was, talk for however long.
Right.
Doing a general introduction to the Sunday, do a general introduction to that cantata, talk about it a little bit, how it fits into Bach's lives, and then went through each movement, so that people who don't have, can't understand the German can nevertheless get a sense of get a sense of what each movement is about, talk about some of the musical features that are noteworthy, that sort of thing, and then play a complete non-stop recording of it afterwards. We cut a deal with the Swedish record company BIS, who recorded the Bach Collegium whole set. They discovered them. And so made them famous, and basically we cut a deal with them where we got to use their recording. They basically we put it at a knockdown price from them. They gave the whole set to us, and then and so I spent a year with him, with Bach, and we covered every Sunday plus the main feast, Ascension, Christmas, all the things that didn't fall on the Sunday as well. And my goodness, was that a year well spent. Because I learned so much more, and just got to spend hours and hours and hours with this man, and his music, and seeing again, through these same musical kind of musical techniques and musical expressions, just got a whole new insights into these Sundays. So when I would be doing this on Monday and Tuesday of the week, in readiness for the following Sunday. After I finish that, I start preparing my sermon for the Sunday.
Yeah, and you're pretty much ahead of the game and ready to
I was
go,
ahead of the game, and because you get into how did the people at the time where death was everywhere?
Yeah.
How do people respond to these same texts? And there's really surprising things like it takes the Sunday after Christmas, where boy Jesus in the temple.
Yeah.
Second Sunday after Christmas, boy Jesus in the temple, where Jesus is missing, and it goes missing from his parents, and the cantata is called "My Jesus is Missing," or "My Lost," and the whole thing is, you start from the perspective of Mary. So, what's it like to have lost Jesus?
Wow.
And what's it like to have lost Jesus as a Christian living today? And that kind of anguish of the soul, which so many people.
Yeah, it's real.
Already you see in the Psalms, where is God? Why are you silent? This kind of my Jesus, and they know and where to find him and what it is to find him again.
Yeah,
which is it's very we say that's not very Lutheran. Lutheran is Jesus finds us. He was never missing. We were missing. But the lost sheep, as far as lost sheep is concerned,
they still feel that
lostness. Where's everybody?
Right. Just so sometimes I think, if you drive everything through, well, I got to put it through this lens, you miss what people are actually feeling. And so, that person that is lost, yes, Jesus is seeking and saving the lost, but they don't see Jesus. And so they feel as if he has abandoned them. The psalmist expressed this, and
absolutely.
We should say, that's real, that's valid, instead of, I'm gonna correct the psalmist here. You should understand this better. Your theology should be better.
and people, because it also then forces people to deny their actual reality.
Hmm.
Because it might be because of your sin that you feel
Sure.
like this, but you nevertheless, this is where you are. I mean,
Yeah.
I hate the expression, meeting people where people are at. It's just terrible English for starters, but but it's true.
Yeah.
You can't go tell people this is what you shouldn't be thinking, that you shouldn't be feeling that you should be experiencing something. You have to say, okay, what is it that you are experiencing?
Right. Right.
And then we might have to diagnose it. Actually, you think it's this, it might actually be something else. It's like my father, who had a heart condition, but for 5 years he thought that he was suffering with acid reflux, and then
Uh,
he went to see a different doctor. Said, no, actually, you acid, you take your acid reflux. That actually you got a heart disease.
wow.
That fixed him. You
Mm,
know, but but he was the symptoms were real.
yeah. Yeah.
So
The
it's no good doctor
diagnosis
saying to
was
you
off.
you can't, yeah. And
Yeah.
so this kind of the freedom to say, look, actually, but what I'm experiencing might not be the gospel,
Yeah.
but it is my life to which the gospel comes.
Right.
So how does this feeling, this experience, this sentiment, or this kind of perspective, how does the gospel meet this? As opposed to, why don't you come and stand over here
And so
where the gospel?
Bach is able, because he's treating the whole person through
Mm,
music and through his the words that accompany the music.
mm.
He helps us then to think of the whole person rather
Yes,
than get.
because he does like what all great artists do, which is they say things and we say, oh, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying
Yeah.
to say. And you get something, whether it's joy or sorrow or just contemplation, is that that's the clothing in which this text, that speaks to me. That makes
Hmm.
that is able to, say something to me in a way that, when Johnny reads "I Have a Dream," it doesn't say anything to me, and then Martin Luther King stands up and says, "Oh, that's what those words mean." And
Mm.
it's that kind of ability to do that, always in the service of the church. I mean, one of his mottos, Bach's mottos, he actually wrote a little tract to, who's complaining about the way that the town council of Leipzig was not treating church music seriously enough. They were making cuts in the wrong places. They're saving money, and they're pointing people to the choir school who couldn't sing because they were good actors. No, we need singers. So he
Hmm.
wrote this little tract called, and the title was "A Short Treatise on a Well-Appointed Church Music."
Hmm.
That's his life. My life's work is to produce a well-appointed church music. And my goodness me, um, what a fantastic um, and blessed sort of a calling that is to really give expression to these things. I mean, it's like, you know what it's like when a congregation suddenly sings a hymn,
Oh yeah.
like the heavens are open. So like, yes,
Yeah.
we know this, man. This really is, in this
Yeah.
country is kind of guide me with a great redeemer or something like that. And then people who don't even go to church will join in.
Mm.
And it's not just because the words are great or because the tune is great, but because they put those two together. It's the
Right.
marriage of text and
And then you also add in, the people who know it and love it,
mm,
and it's moving them, and so then they sing in such a way that it moves those around them, and it's a
mm.
cumulative.
Yeah, yeah, and what it does is it penetrates into the kind of it becomes part of the culture,
Hmm. Mm.
a culture of its time, and it gives a kind of a it's like the old I don't know if you have in the States have this sort of tradition of brides sort of a bride at a wedding should have something old, something new, something blue. That's the kind of old
Yeah,
saying.
I don't know if that actually happens anymore or not. Yeah, I remember the
Well, my
saying from
wife, my wife
childhood.
had something old,
Yeah.
something new, something blue,
Yeah.
and by this idea, it's or what Jesus talks about, the scribes who take something, from the treasury, take old and new. This idea
Yeah.
that you take your place within the tradition, and
Yeah.
then you bring your contribution to that tradition.
Mm.
We don't do
Yeah.
what our culture does is, we've had this of nearly a century of modernism. We say
Ugh.
stuff tradition we're going to build from scratch,
Right.
and we've
Right.
lost the
And
sense
we're
of beauty.
poorer for it.
Oh, we are infinitely poorer
Yeah.
for it, and we've devastated our cityscapes, our landscapes, our musical sound worlds, our literature. Everything's been devastated. I mean, who reads and writes poetry anymore? Because it's become this impenetrable thing that isn't designed to express the common human spirit or
Mm.
the God-given human spirit, but rather the expressiveness of the individual.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, actually, I am part of the communion of saints. I'm part of a much bigger thing. I'm part of a very long arc of history, and I'm just taking my place within it,
Yeah.
leaving my mark on it, so that I have done something that has added to it, has enriched it.
Yeah, it's I'm thinking back to the first Peter reading I had last week, not this week, but the previous Sunday, with the like living stones that are
Yeah,
being built together into a spiritual temple. And
yeah,
so,
yeah.
individually we are, a little stone. What is a little stone worth? But you build all of these little stones together and you have this grand structure. But, individually it's nothing. But collectively the Lord builds it into this wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And each stone, though, has to depend on the stones around it. And
Yeah,
so
I
if
mean,
you
yeah.
if you are built together, it's something great. If you're just on your own, it's not much.
And you take, if you go, take Bach as an example. You got Bach, who, you know, undoubtedly an exceptional musician. I mean, he was such a good keyboard player. He was two occasions at least, he agreed to a contest with a kind of these traveling virtuosos.
Oh, I've read
And
about that. Yeah.
yeah, and when they heard him practice, they escaped in the middle of the night before the and Bach walked all the way to meet Handel. He walked 2 days to meet Handel, and Handel heard he was coming and made sure he left before Bach got there. He was a fearsome musician, but he was only what he was because of where he was.
Mm-hmm.
That he was born into, they had those people as his parents
Mm.
and brothers and cousins, and he
Yeah.
was in that church setting and in that cultural and educational setting.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if somewhere in Outer Mongolia there's been a boy who is far more gifted than Bach, could have been the greatest musician ever, but he spent his whole time herding horses
Sure.
on the grasslands.
Right.
Who knows?
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I'm so, I have sort of passion for and a mourning for education in our culture again, because you've got all these gifts that are not being nurtured,
Yeah.
because we're too busy just making sure everyone can do the 3 R's and think that our job's done at that point, as opposed to seeing this wide, again, the whole human person. What do when the heavens are open for us in the scriptures a few times, what is the activity that takes place? It's singing. It's singing. I'm pretty convinced that we will be too full of the joys of God's people in heaven to stand still and to talk. It's just, sometimes you go, if you go to some occasion, you go, I don't know, a ball game or a concert or something, and nobody's standing still and nobody's just chatting. Everybody's singing and waving there, at the very least, waving around in there. I can't dance to save my life. I've got 2 left wooden legs, but, sometimes you just can't stand still, too full of joy, too full of just the sheer joy of the occasion. You can't sit and you can't just talk. You have to start singing.
It's fascinating because in the American culture, especially, men tend not to sing. There's this thing about, well, men just stand there and like I don't get it. I don't understand it, because you look at the men in history, and if you think of King David, the manliest man you can think of, in the Old Testament. Oh, well, he's going to sing.
Yeah.
And you look at soccer games happening in Europe, and there's this singing happening during the middle of the game, and then you get to the American context, and you have these men that are just stand there like, I can't let anybody hear me sing. I don't know why it is,
And you're
but I
missing
certainly
out.
grieve that.
Yeah, you're missing out. I mean, there's so much. I mean, modern research into the effects of singing is just the fact that you're breathing deeply means that you're oxygenating your blood. You feel better.
Mm-hmm.
It's good for your mental health, and there's been studies that show that if you sing on your own, it improves your physical and your mental health, and it also increases things like executive function. It makes you better at school, basically. But if you sing in a group, that's multiplied.
I experience that every time we have choir practice. I'm happier afterwards. I'm in a better mood afterwards.
Absolutely, and it's scientifically shown to be the case, and that's, but like in this country, there are three places where people sing: church, in part, it's a
Hmm.
community, church, games, football games,
Right.
and rugby games, and if they get really drunk in a pub, right? And so people who don't go to church and don't go to the terraces to watch games, there's just no communal singing there.
Yeah,
Cool. And schools so do less and less singing, and
that's true.
you're missing out.
Yeah,
Whereas, again, Luther, he as a little boy, he used to go around and earn part of his school fees by
right,
singing.
right.
My kids all play instruments and things, and they can make a killing. Like around Christmas, you can make £50 an hour, $60, $70 an hour, just playing Christmas carols in the cold for an hour. It's good money.
Uh-huh.
But but you're entering into this is existing tradition, which is built on centuries and centuries and centuries, and it's a simple fact:
It's
construction is
fascinating.
hard,
Yeah. So that
demolition is easy,
that might be
and
something we need to come back and talk about on another, a future episode, is just the structure, the the cultural influences and ways in which maybe parents can try to recreate some of that for their
yeah,
children and
and
build that
churches,
in. And
churches,
churches, yes,
churches.
because I think that's a huge topic that we're scratching the surface of. But I think you make a really good point with that.
Mm,
And that's something that, rather than just complain about it, all right, what are the things that we can do to help make the changes that would benefit our individual, the individuals around us, but our larger culture as well.
yeah,
So
yeah, but
okay, yeah,
it's such an enormous, everything in it. I think that's great. Part of this topic is so fascinating because everything comes together in it.
yeah,
We haven't even talked about architecture.
oh
How
yeah.
church architecture plays a
That
significant
may
part.
that may be another future conversation too, because
Yeah, yeah.
I
But it's part of the world of Bach.
I think coming out of um that late 20th century where things became just bland and boxy, and there was no aesthetic beauty taken into account. Oftentimes it was more just functionality again.
Oh yeah,
I think we need to rediscover some of the blending of, yes,
yeah,
function matters, but
absolutely.
boy, beauty matters too.
Yeah, and but also how beauty and function come together. So if you walked into
Yeah.
St. Thomas Church in Leipzig on a Sunday morning in divine service, and Bach is conducting his latest cantata, you can hear everything and you can't see a thing.
Mm,
You can't see the musicians,
yeah.
but you can hear them. What you
Wow.
can see is the pulpit and the altar,
Yeah.
and
All
it's
right.
that.
Awesome. I
And
want to come back to that. I do,
yeah,
because I think that's a great conversation. Okay. Anything else you want to share regarding Bach? We're probably an hour plus in already.
yeah. Sorry, you get me going on
It's
this topic.
good. It's good. And
Yeah,
I think, if people that are listening, there's so many different aspects of this
mm,
um, that we can dive into. But I think there's an appreciation, I think, generally, that people have for Bach, but the depth of knowledge, of understanding, is very, very, very shallow. And so you've been able to help expand that somewhat. I guess one thing I would ask is, what is, first of all, your favorite piece? And second of all, if you're talking to someone who is maybe not knowledgeable at all,
mm.
where would you have them start?
Favorite piece, my goodness me, too many, too many. So if I give you a top list, I'm going
Okay,
to
give
have.
me like a top five or something like
Okay,
that,
so the
maybe.
both Matthew and John Passions
Yeah.
and the B minor mass are the kind of on the choral side. They are there, and I mean some of the cantatas are just. There's probably my favorite cantata is known as the Actus Tragicus. Is his cantata? It's a funeral cantata, which I want at my funeral.
Mm.
And my only regret is if they sing it, I won't be there to listen. Uh, they're fantastic. The Brandenburg concertos are
Yeah.
fantastic, brilliant. I
Number two
particularly,
is my favorite,
yeah,
absolute
two. I
favorite.
love two and two and four, my favorites. Um, his solo violin and solo cello suites and partitas are just astonishing. They are just endlessly. endlessly enriching. You can never get bored of those. But there's just so much, the list would be as long as the chat so far. So
So, where would you
that's
have
where
someone
everyone's
start if they say, okay, I'd like to try to expand and get more into this kind of music. Where would I start?
if you want a kind of an easy entrance in, I would recommend the Brandenburg concertos,
Yeah,
particularly number two. I think that's probably the kind. That's where I would start. I wouldn't start with number one.
it's
Um,
candy. It's it's
it's just
so easy.
it's just so delightful. Or the fourth one as well. It's just so joyful. I would probably the violin concertos are really really
Yeah.
stunning, and they are just so danceable. They're
Hmm.
literally danceable and then singable in the slow movements. Um, those would probably be the kind of go-to place as just to say, look, this is really worth exploring. There's on the vocal side, as I said, the Actus Tragicus is just it's one of those really early ones. It's in the old German style. It's just so beautiful.
Mm.
Um, and of the passions, the St. John Passion is probably easier as a sort of first sitting is only just under 2 hours as opposed to 3.5, or an hour and a half in a modern performance. And I would, by the way, recommend that if you're listening online, Spotify or or some other sort of online service, I would recommend picking a fairly recent recording from the last 30 years, because the style of performance has really changed. People have really understood much better in the last 30, 40 years the instruments that would Bach were used by. And the modern instruments are more versatile. They got richer tone than the
Hmm.
Bach didn't write for them. He wrote for those instruments, and you can tell the difference. So I would really recommend something like violin. Violin. Somebody like Rachel Podger. Rachel Podger on the violin. It just you can't do better than that. She's an English baroque violinist, and she will. It's just endlessly fascinating. You will never ever grow bored of her playing a Bach. So
And
anything you get your hands on,
the Collegium in Japan. The
Palladium in Japan, or the Monteverdi Choir, John Eliot Gardiner. I mean, those. I mean, they're very very different. Bach Palladium Japan understands the theology and is pure, and it's
mm,
just faultless. John Eliot Gardiner is really dramatic. He's an opera conductor at heart, and he brings out the drama of this stuff like nobody else. So there is stuff to keep you going for a long 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 time.
nice. All right. Well, thank you for your time today, and yeah, we'll have to be doing this again before too long, and talk about some of these other
It's always a
subjects.
pleasure, and I enjoy it. I have to put in a plug that do go to lutheranradio.co.uk.
Yes, yes, and I'm going to
And
put that link in
yeah,
the bottom in the comments there, so that people can find those Sunday cantatas.
yes, and all the good stuff that's on that radio station. It's a little known gem, so do go
It
listen.
is. It is.
Yeah,
I've got my mug here with the Lutheran Radio UK. Yeah.
doesn't everybody?
Oh, I don't know. Not that many in the States probably, but
Oh, there
probably
you go.
everybody over there does.
You're special.
All right, thanks again, and
Thank
we
you.
look forward to having you on Lutheran World once more in the future.
Much appreciated. God bless you.